The Unabomber, the man who hated the machine. 1942, Chicago, Illinois. In the middle of a world at war, under the grey industrial skies of Chicago, a child was born who would one day wage a different kind of war, not against nations, but against the machines that powered them. May 22nd, 1942, Chicago, Illinois. Theodore John Kaczynski entered the world on a humid spring day, the first child of Wanda and Theodore Kaczynski Sr., Polish-American parents from a working-class background. His father, a sausage maker turned factory worker, and his mother, a driven and intelligent woman, were both children of immigrants who believed deeply in education as the great American ladder. The world outside the Kaczynski home was turbulent. Chicago's skyline was thick with the smoke of wartime industry. Trains roared through the steel yards and factories churned day and night. Inside, however, there was calm, order, and the quiet pulse of ambition. Wanda, ever attentive, kept a spotless home and read constantly to her newborn son. She was determined that her child would rise above the grind of the city, above the noise and smoke. Neighbours would later recall her almost obsessive concern with Ted's development. She spoke of him with the intensity of someone who believed she was raising not just a son, but a mind that might someday matter. A family of routine and discipline. The Kaczynski household in those early years was governed by structure. Wanda kept notebooks about Ted's milestones, his first words, his reading progress, his interests. The family wasn't wealthy, but they were intellectual in aspiration. Dinner conversations often revolved around science, politics, and the post-war dream of human progress. Theodore Sr., a rational man of secular beliefs, worked long hours, but remained emotionally steady and encouraging. He nurtured a curiosity in his son for how things worked, the inner mechanics of nature and man-made systems. There was a harmony there, a picture of ordinary American striving. But even within that, the seeds of something else were quietly being planted. Isolation. Wanda would later recall that Ted didn't play easily with other children. He was shy, introspective, and easily overwhelmed by noise and chaos. He preferred books to people, puzzles to playmates. The post-war Chicago suburb around him was bursting with optimism and conformity. But Ted, even at 5 or 6, seemed to stand apart from it. A near-tragic episode. When Ted was just 9 months old, he developed a severe allergic reaction. Hives spread across his body, and he was rushed to the hospital. There, due to hospital policy at the time, he was isolated from his parents for several days. When Wanda finally saw her baby again, she later said, "He was never the same." The boy who had once smiled and reached for her now turned away. He was distant, withdrawn, and fearful. In later psychological analyses, this episode was cited repeatedly, a possible first fracture in Ted Kaczynski's emotional connection to the world. Though one can never pinpoint the roots of alienation to a single event, that period of isolation became an enduring metaphor in Ted's life. The solitary child, alone behind glass, looking out at a world he could not touch. Post-war America, the machine age. By the late 1940s, America was changing. Factories that had built tanks and aircraft were now producing refrigerators, radios, and the first computers. The hum of machinery became the soundtrack of progress, and Chicago, with its clanging rail yards and shimmering skyline, stood as a symbol of technological triumph. For most Americans, this was the dawn of a new age. For the Kaczynski family, it was simply the environment in which they lived. But for young Ted, it was a sensory and moral landscape being quietly absorbed. The constant industrial buzz of his hometown, the smell of exhaust and metal, the mechanical rhythm of trains, all of it would leave an impression. To some, it was progress. To others, it was noise. To Ted, it may have been the first sign of something unnatural in the human order. A mind set apart. By age 5, Ted's intelligence was unmistakable. He was reading children's encyclopedias, building simple electrical circuits, and solving math problems far beyond his years. His teachers noted not just brilliance but intensity, a rare, almost unsettling focus. While other children fidgeted or daydreamed, Ted stared straight ahead, absorbing everything. His memory was photographic, his reasoning precise. But there was a quietness to him, a lack of play. His classmates would later describe him as different, not in a cruel way, but as a child somehow elsewhere. Wanda nurtured his talents with fierce pride. She spent hours reading to him, teaching him piano, encouraging him to write. But even she could not bridge the emotional distance that seemed to grow as Ted's intellect outpaced his peers. The Kaczynskis moved to the suburb of Evergreen Park, seeking better schools and a safer environment. Yet even there, Ted's brilliance set him apart. Early fascinations. In his solitude, Ted turned to the natural world. He spent long hours in the backyard observing insects, the way ants built their tunnels, the structure of spider webs. He found order there, a simplicity of design and purpose that contrasted sharply with the clamour of human life. Books became his true companions, volumes on mathematics, logic, and science. He read about Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, and Charles Darwin, fascinated by minds that seemed to unlock the universe through reason alone. But his fascination wasn't only with understanding systems, it was also with control. In one childhood anecdote, he was said to have dismantled a clock just to see its inner workings, then reassembled it perfectly. To Ted, mastery over complexity was comfort. Wanda's dream, Ted's distance. Wanda dreamed of her son becoming a great scientist, perhaps a physicist or mathematician. She saw his gifts as proof that their sacrifices were worth it. But the more she pushed him toward excellence, the further he seemed to retreat inward. Ted's social world shrank as his intellectual world expanded. At family gatherings, he was polite but quiet. At school, he excelled, but rarely spoke. Teachers saw genius, classmates saw enigma. In later years, classmates remembered a boy who was like a little adult, always serious, never frivolous. Some admired him, others ignored him. Ted, for his part, seemed content with the distance. A quiet Chicago home, 1940s America. The Kaczynski household of the 1940s was not unusual. There were family dinners, chores, radio programs in the evening. Yet, beneath that normalcy was a growing gap between Ted and the world around him. As the post-war era blossomed into the age of consumerism, the television and the automobile became symbols of progress. For Ted, however, this rising tide of technology, though still abstract to a child, represented something cold and impersonal. In the patterns of his early thinking, one can glimpse a mind drawn to order, but disturbed by excess. To him, machines were fascinating not because they empowered humanity, but because they revealed how dependent humans had become on their own creations. Seeds of a paradox. From the beginning, Theodore Kaczynski was a child of paradox. Born into the industrial heart of America, nurtured by reason and science, and yet destined to reject both. The same world that celebrated his intellect would later recoil from what it produced. The same parents who nurtured his brilliance would one day struggle to comprehend the darkness it concealed. The Chicago of 1942 was a city of noise and motion, the living emblem of man's technological might. For most, it was the promise of a better tomorrow. For one quiet child, it may have been the first whisper of a machine he would one day come to hate. 1949, early childhood. By 1949, America stood on the threshold of a new era. The war was over. The machines that once built bombs now built comfort. Suburbs stretched outward like circuitry across the American landscape. And within one quiet home on Chicago's outskirts, a small boy began to see the world not as a playground, but as a problem to be solved. A gifted child in Evergreen Park. Theodore John Kaczynski was 7 years old when his parents moved the family to Evergreen Park, a modest middle-class suburb southwest of Chicago. The neighborhood was new and tidy, tree-lined streets, identical houses, and backyards fenced with chain link. It was the promise of post-war prosperity, a haven for families chasing the American dream. To his mother, Wanda, this move meant opportunity, better schools, better neighbors, and above all, a safer environment for her gifted son. By now, Ted's intelligence was undeniable. He read books well beyond his grade level, the world of mathematics, the boy's book of science experiments, the story of numbers. Teachers marveled at his comprehension, and fellow students whispered that he was some kind of little genius. In class, Ted's pencil raced across paper faster than anyone else's. He solved problems in his head that others needed calculators for, though calculators didn't yet exist in schools, only slide rules and intuition. But with that brilliance came something else. Distance. He rarely spoke unless called upon, and when he did, his voice was quiet, almost detached, as though every word was weighed before release. The early pattern of solitude. Children of his age played baseball in the streets, rode bicycles in packs, and swapped comic books. Ted preferred solitude. He'd sit in the grass, studying insects crawling between the blades, or lie on his stomach for hours tracing the movements of ants across the sidewalk cracks. Nature, to him, wasn't merely scenery. It was order, structure, a realm untouched by human folly. Wanda sometimes watched from the kitchen window, concerned. "Go play with the other boys," she'd urge, drying her hands on a towel. Ted would nod politely, but rarely go. The noise of groups, the shouting, the chaos, made him uncomfortable. He retreated into his thoughts, into the pages of books, into problems no one else cared to solve. His teachers noticed. Some admired his focus, others worried about it. Brilliant but distant, one report card read. A mind far beyond his years but emotionally isolated. For a time, that didn't seem to trouble anyone, not even Ted. After all, the world admired the gifted. What it didn't yet understand was the loneliness that often came with genius, mathematics as sanctuary. By age 8, Ted's favourite subject was mathematics. To him, numbers weren't abstract. They were alive, pulsing with meaning. He saw patterns everywhere. The rhythm of raindrops against the window pane, the symmetry of leaves, the repetition of footsteps on concrete. Math offered him a refuge, a place where truth was absolute, where human unpredictability couldn't intrude. His father, Theodore Sr., encouraged this fascination. On weekends, he would bring home math puzzles clipped from newspapers or printed on cereal boxes. The two would sit at the kitchen table solving them together. His father saw it as bonding. Ted saw it as peace, an orderly connection in a world that too often felt chaotic. At night, Wanda would read to her sons. First Ted, then his younger brother David, born in 1949. She was proud of both, but Ted remained her project, the vessel of her hopes. She pushed him toward excellence, reinforcing discipline and intellect as the highest virtues. Love, for Wanda, was expressed through education, but in that structure, emotional warmth sometimes got lost. Ted learned that to be loved was to excel, to fail, or to need others was weakness. The quiet observer. Ted's teachers began to notice his peculiar relationship with the world around him. He rarely made eye contact. He avoided group activities, but he was observant, intensely so. He noticed the smallest details others missed. The exact moment when the clock's second hand ticked over, the subtle change in a teacher's tone when she was nervous, the rhythm of chalk tapping against the board. He lived like an observer, not a participant. To Ted, life was an equation to be studied from the outside. He didn't yet resent the world, but he didn't belong to it either. And that detachment, invisible to most, would become a defining feature of his personality. A changing America. The late 1940s and early 1950s were the dawn of America's technological optimism. The transistor had just been invented. Automobiles filled every driveway. Television flickered into homes, bringing with it a new kind of unity and conformity. Progress became the national religion, and technology its sacred text. Ted grew up surrounded by this gospel of innovation. Neighbors boasted about new appliances, new cars, and the miracle of the modern age. But Ted, even as a child, saw the other side. The noise, the consumption, the uniformity. He didn't articulate it yet, but he sensed something hollow beneath the sheen of progress. The irony, of course, was that he owed much of his early success to that same world, a public education system made possible by industrial growth, a middle-class life built on machinery. Yet something within him recoiled from it all. Where others saw convenience, Ted saw dependence. A mother's faith. Wanda Kaczynski's devotion to her son bordered on zealous. She wrote letters to teachers, requesting special reading material and accelerated coursework. She kept scrapbooks of his achievements and reminded him constantly of his gift. In her eyes, Ted was destined for greatness, a mind that could change the world. She also sensed, with maternal intuition, that her son's brilliance came at a cost. "He doesn't laugh much," she once confided to a friend. "Sometimes I feel like he's carrying something heavy, but he can't say what it is." But in post-war America, where emotions were private and stoicism was virtue, such concerns went unspoken. Wanda believed structure could fix anything, routine, study, and moral instruction. And so she doubled down on discipline, believing that focus would keep her son steady. If only she could see that it was the very rigidity, the pressure of perfection, that deepened Ted's internal divide. Schoolyard isolation. By the time Ted reached 4th grade, he had few friends. Children teased him for being quiet, for using words they didn't understand, for preferring books to games. He wasn't bullied in the violent sense, just excluded. And exclusion, to a child who already felt apart, can feel like erasure. At recess, Ted often stood alone near the edge of the playground watching the other kids form teams, pick sides, laugh together. He didn't envy them. He analyzed them. Later in life, when psychologists would try to understand his alienation, they'd return to these moments. The child who studied society as though he were already separate from it. Teachers described him as odd but brilliant. Students called him weird. To Ted, those labels didn't sting. They confirmed what he already believed, that he was different, maybe even superior. But superiority, without connection, is a lonely kingdom. A brother's arrival. When his younger brother David was born, Ted's life shifted again. At first he was distant, uninterested in the baby. But as they grew, David became the only person Ted truly trusted. The two would share long walks through the neighborhood woods, talking about insects, planets, and the shape of the moon. David adored his older brother, saw him as a guide and protector. Ted, in turn, was gentle with David, patient in teaching him, protective in his quiet way. For all his detachment from others, Ted wasn't cruel. He was capable of affection, even tenderness, but his empathy was narrow, reserved only for those within his tiny emotional circle. This relationship would matter deeply in later years. It was David who would ultimately help identify Ted as the Unabomber, an act of betrayal and salvation intertwined. But in 1949 they were simply brothers, walking side by side through the innocent fields of Evergreen Park. A pattern emerging. Looking back, it's easy to trace the pattern. A mind wired for precision, born into a culture of conformity. A child celebrated for intellect but starved of connection. A family that prized order over emotion. Ted's world was small but structured, rational but sterile, and within that structure, his own identity began to calcify, logical, analytical, and increasingly detached from the messiness of human feeling. The child in the mirror. Before he was a criminal, before he was a recluse, Theodore Kaczynski was a child staring out at a world he could not quite touch, a world too loud, too false, too mechanical. In the classroom, he found numbers. In the woods, he found silence. Between them, he would spend his life searching for meaning. And so the boy from Evergreen Park grew older, sharper, quieter, a gifted student in an age that worshipped progress, yet one who already sensed that progress might come at a terrible cost. The machine was rising, and Ted Kaczynski was already learning to hate its hum. 1958, Harvard University. In 1958, America was electrified by optimism. Sputnik circled the Earth, the transistor transformed communication, and Harvard University stood as a temple to intellect. Into this crucible of ambition arrived a 16-year-old boy, a mathematical prodigy from a quiet Chicago suburb. His name was Theodore John Kaczynski, and within Harvard's ivy-covered walls, his mind would be tested in ways that would change him forever. Arrival at Harvard. Ted Kaczynski arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the fall of 1958, barely 16 years old, the youngest member of his freshman class. To his parents it was triumph, proof that their long years of nurturing had succeeded. To Ted, it was dislocation. Harvard was vast, intimidating, and filled with students older, louder, and more socially adept. They came from prep schools and wealthy families, wore tailored suits, and discussed literature and politics with casual confidence. Ted, thin, shy, and awkward, felt out of place the moment he arrived. He lived in Eliot House, one of Harvard's historic dormitories. The building was elegant, its halls lined with portraits of past scholars and leaders. Yet for Ted it was sterile, another machine of intellect, humming with competition and pressure. He didn't attend parties or join clubs. He ate meals alone, sometimes without speaking a word to anyone for days. His roommate later remembered him as quiet, polite, but completely detached, like he wasn't really there. The Harvard environment. The Harvard of the late 1950s was a place of ambition and cold brilliance. It celebrated the human mind as an engine of progress, precisely the worldview Ted would later reject. Professors spoke of technology as destiny, of science as salvation. The air was thick with the future. To Ted, it was suffocating. He attended lectures on mathematics, physics, and logic, where ideas moved at lightning speed. Yet while he excelled academically, he struggled emotionally. The social codes of university life were foreign to him. The boisterous laughter in the dining hall, the casual flirtations, the shared jokes, all of it made him feel like an alien observing another species. Ted's academic advisor noticed his isolation, but interpreted it as focus. "Brilliant young man," he wrote, "but introverted to an extreme." Ted was learning the paradox of genius in a social world. The brighter the mind, the deeper the shadow. The Murray experiments. In his sophomore year, Ted was recruited into a psychological study led by Dr. Henry A. Murray, a respected psychologist and former OSS officer who had helped design wartime interrogation techniques. The experiment was described as a study on personality development and stress. Students were asked to write detailed essays outlining their personal philosophies, what they believed, what they valued, how they saw the world. Ted, ever earnest, poured himself into the task. He articulated a view of logic, morality, and individuality that was idealistic and deeply rational. He wrote of independence, of the sanctity of the human mind, of resisting conformity, themes that would later echo in his manifesto. But what followed was not what he expected. After submitting their essays, the students were brought into a laboratory setting. There, under bright light and in front of cameras, their ideas were attacked, viciously, by an anonymous interrogator trained to humiliate and break them down. For hours they were subjected to verbal assaults, their beliefs mocked, their personalities dissected. The sessions were recorded on film. To the researchers, it was a test of resilience. To Ted, it was betrayal. A mind under siege. Ted endured the sessions for 3 years. Each week he returned to the lab, sat in the chair, and faced another round of psychological warfare. The interrogator, likely acting under Murray's direction, would deride his writing, laugh at his ideals, and provoke him emotionally. Ted, unable to defend himself socially, internalized the humiliation. He later described feeling violated, as though his mind, the one thing he valued most, had been invaded. At 16, he had entered Harvard full of promise. By 19, he was retreating into silence, distrust, and growing contempt for the social order around him. Psychologists later speculated that these experiments, conducted without informed consent, may have been a formative trauma. They stripped away his belief in intellectual institutions and planted the seed of suspicion that would one day define his worldview, that human beings were being conditioned, manipulated, and dehumanized by systems of control. Life in the shadows of Harvard. Outside the laboratory, Ted's existence was monotonous and lonely. He spent most of his time in the library or in his dorm room immersed in mathematics. He studied topology, the abstract study of shapes and spaces, where he found a purity that human life seemed to lack. In equations, there were no lies, no hypocrisy, no cruelty. There was only truth. But as his mastery of math deepened, his connection to people weakened. He wrote no letters home except brief, factual updates. He rarely spoke in class. He appeared content, but inwardly, a quiet bitterness was taking shape. He began to see other students not as peers, but as conformists, servants of a system that rewarded obedience. He would later write that Harvard taught him how little of the human there was left in modern man. The Cold War context. The broader world of 1958 was one of nuclear fear and technological fascination. The launch of Sputnik had shocked America, fueling an arms race of intellect and innovation. Universities like Harvard became battlegrounds for the future, centers where minds were trained not only to think, but to serve the machinery of progress. Ted absorbed this atmosphere with growing discomfort. The idea that technology would save humanity felt to him like a delusion. He saw how progress came with a price: conformity, control, and alienation. Though he couldn't yet articulate it, he was forming a philosophy that technology enslaved rather than liberated, that human nature was being reshaped by machines. These thoughts were still embryonic, unspoken, but they simmered beneath the surface. A fracture deepens. By his junior year, Ted's demeanor had changed. He spoke less, smiled rarely, and withdrew completely from social life. Professors saw him as a model student. Classmates saw him as a ghost. In the evenings, he would take long walks through the Harvard yard, past the lamplight and the autumn leaves. He often walked alone in the snow, his mind churning with abstract ideas, logic, structure, control, and the fragility of human will. He began to despise what he saw as weakness, emotionality, conformity, dependence. He admired the precision of machines, but hated what they represented: domination over nature, over thought, over freedom. Years later, when his writings were analyzed by the FBI, investigators would find traces of this period in his rhetoric, the language of control and resistance, born from a university that worshipped intellect but neglected the soul. The Harvard years end. Ted graduated from Harvard in 1962 at the age of 20. His record was exemplary, nearly perfect grades glowing. Recommendations and a reputation as a brilliant but isolated thinker. His professors encouraged him to pursue graduate study, and he was accepted to the University of Michigan with a full scholarship in mathematics. To the world, this was success. To Ted, it was escape. Escape from the cold laboratories, the laughter of strangers, the manipulation of the Murray experiments. He would later describe Harvard as the worst experience of my life, though he rarely elaborated. The trauma of those years remained buried, unspoken, yet alive in the structure of his thought. The wounds of intellect. At Harvard, Theodore Kaczynski learned 2 lessons: that intellect could be weaponized, and that those in power would use science to shape men's souls. He entered as a prodigy, a believer in reason. He left as a skeptic, wary of institutions, distrustful of authority, and increasingly alienated from humanity itself. In the heart of America's most prestigious university, a dangerous paradox had been born. A man who loved logic, yet would one day use it to wage war on the very system that had celebrated his mind. The boy who sought truth had begun his slow transformation into the man who would one day declare war on the machine. 1962, University of Michigan. In the fall of 1962, a 20-year-old prodigy arrived in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He carried little more than a suitcase and a stack of mathematics papers. His name was Theodore John Kaczynski. At Harvard, he had learned how intellect could wound the soul. At Michigan, he would learn how brilliance could become isolation. A new beginning. The University of Michigan was colder, quieter, and less intimidating than Harvard. The town of Ann Arbor, surrounded by forests and rolling farmland, offered a slower rhythm of life, a sharp contrast to the elitism and intensity of Cambridge. For Ted Kaczynski, it was a reprieve. Here, among other graduate students and mathematicians, he hoped to rebuild himself, to focus purely on his discipline, mathematics, a world of pure logic, untouched by social deception. He entered the PhD program in 1962, specializing in complex analysis and geometric function theory. His professors quickly recognized his talent. He was precise, methodical, and capable of seeing connections others missed. His mathematical intuition bordered on uncanny. But even in this more forgiving environment, Ted remained distant. He rented a small, sparsely furnished apartment near campus, a bed, a desk, and shelves lined with books. He cooked simple meals, lived frugally, and avoided almost all social contact. He had no radio, no television, and no interest in the world outside numbers. Mathematics as refuge for Ted. Mathematics wasn't merely a subject, it was salvation. In proofs and theorems he found the order that life lacked. Every equation had a resolution, every problem a truth. He could spend 16 hours a day working on a single problem, forgetting to eat or sleep. Fellow graduate students occasionally saw him in the mathematics library at 2 or 3 in the morning, scribbling notes with furious precision. His doctoral advisor, Professor Alan Shields, later recalled him as one of the brightest students I ever had, but also one of the most withdrawn. Ted's dissertation, completed in 1967, was titled Boundary Functions. It was so advanced that most mathematicians could barely follow it. One faculty member described it as the most impressive dissertation I have ever examined. The work would later earn the Sumner B. Myers Prize for Best Mathematical Dissertation of the Year. And yet, for all this intellectual triumph, Ted's emotional world remained barren. Life beyond the blackboard. Outside the math department, Ted was almost invisible. He didn't date, didn't attend parties, didn't join clubs. When students gathered for beers or to discuss philosophy, Ted stayed away. He was polite but curt, never rude, just uninterested. His eyes carried a kind of distant sharpness, as though always calculating something unseen. The cracks begin to show. By 1964, the quiet perfection of his routine began to fracture. Ted had started to feel restless, not with his work, but with the purpose of it. He began questioning why mathematics mattered. What was the point of creating proofs that only a handful of people in the world could understand? He started to sense an emptiness in pure abstraction. His mind, trained to dissect logic, turned inward, dissecting itself. Around this time, his diaries reveal the stirrings of something darker, a fascination with the loss of human freedom in modern society. He wrote about industrial domination and the psychological toll of technological dependency. These were still vague musings, but the core ideas that would later define the Unabomber manifesto were already forming. He began to view modern civilization as a kind of cage, comfortable, efficient, and soul-killing. Isolation and resentment. Ted's isolation deepened as his peers began to form professional networks and friendships. He saw how academia rewarded self-promotion, conformity, and collaboration. All things he despised. He viewed himself as a purist, a seeker of truth in a world of compromise. Yet beneath that intellectual pride, resentment was brewing. He felt unseen, misunderstood, and increasingly disgusted by the petty social games of academia. He began to withdraw further, skipping faculty events and departmental gatherings. When he did attend, he often stood alone, expressionless, watching others converse with ease. In his mind, he began to divide humanity into two kinds, the independent thinker and the conformist slave. He knew which one he wanted to be, but he also knew how lonely that path would be. The early notebooks around 1965, Ted began keeping private notebooks, dense pages of mathematical formulas interspersed with philosophical reflections. In between equations, he wrote about the loss of wild nature, the domination of man by his own systems, and the machine as the destroyer of human autonomy. These writings were not yet coherent ideology, but they revealed an early sense of alienation from technological society. He admired the simplicity of earlier times, when survival depended on nature, not machines. He began fantasizing about escape, about living alone in the wilderness, away from what he saw as the corrupting influence of modern life. In one early entry he wrote, "A man is free only when he lives in balance with the natural world. Technology is the enemy of that balance." It was a seed, one that would grow quietly in the margins of his equations. Teaching and discontent. During his years at Michigan, Ted occasionally worked as a teaching assistant. His reputation among students was mixed. Some found him brilliant and helpful. Others found him intimidating, even cold. He had little patience for error or imprecision. When students struggled with basic concepts, Ted's tone could become clipped, his explanations mechanical. He didn't mean to be cruel. He simply couldn't understand why others didn't think as he did. Still, among faculty, his talent was unquestioned. Ted was not just smart, one professor recalled. He was a genius, but something was missing. He was like a computer, brilliant logic, no warmth. That absence of connection, of empathy, would soon shape the next decisive turn in his life, a growing aversion to society. By the time he completed his PhD in 1967, Ted had come to see society as fundamentally broken. He admired the precision of mathematics but saw no similar order in human life. People, he felt, were irrational, driven by greed and vanity. He resented the growing role of machines, not only in industry but in human thought. Computers were beginning to appear in research labs. Automation was transforming labor. To many, this was progress. To Ted, it was the beginning of dehumanization. He viewed the technological system as self-perpetuating, a force that demanded growth, efficiency, and control at the expense of individuality and freedom. He would later write, "Once a technical innovation appears, society becomes dependent on it, and there is no turning back." That thought, the idea of irreversible dependence, terrified him. It also shaped the fundamental belief that would one day define his war, that technological progress, left unchecked, would destroy the essence of humanity. The decision to leave. When Ted defended his dissertation in 1967, he was only 25. The faculty praised his work. A bright academic career awaited him. Job offers would soon follow, including one from the University of California, Berkeley. But deep down, Ted was already planning his escape. He had begun to fantasize about withdrawing from society entirely, to live alone, without machines, without human interference. He imagined building a small cabin in the wilderness, living off the land, surviving by intellect and will alone. To him, this wasn't madness. It was purity. He once told a classmate, "Maybe someday I'll just disappear into the woods." The classmate laughed, thinking it a joke. It wasn't. The Quiet Revolution. Within, at Michigan, Ted Kaczynski perfected the art of logic. But in that perfection, he discovered something terrifying. That reason alone cannot save the human soul. He had mastered mathematics, yet found no meaning in it. He had sought truth, and instead found emptiness. The wilderness began calling to him, not as a place of escape, but as a place of rebirth. He began to see civilization as a sickness, and nature as its cure. He would leave Michigan with honors, but also with the first full vision of what he would one day become, a man who would abandon society to wage war against it, a hermit, a philosopher, and ultimately a bomber. The mind that had conquered complexity now turned toward destruction. Methodical, deliberate, inevitable. 1967, Berkeley teaching. By 1967, the world had entered the electronic age. Transistors were shrinking, computers were spreading, and the counterculture was questioning everything. Into that mix stepped a 25-year-old mathematician, a prodigy from Michigan, armed with equations and silence. His name was Theodore Kaczynski. For a brief moment, he became a professor at one of America's most brilliant universities, and for an even briefer moment, he tried to belong. Arrival at Berkeley. In the autumn of 1967, the University of California, Berkeley was alive with noise. The Vietnam War raged overseas and protests shook the campus daily. Students marched through Sproul Plaza chanting for peace and freedom. Tear gas drifted like morning fog. Amid this turbulence, a thin young man in a worn suit took his place at the chalkboard. Dr. Theodore J. Kaczynski, the youngest assistant professor in the mathematics department's history. Colleagues were astonished that someone so young, so quiet, had produced a dissertation of such brilliance. "He'll go far," one said. But even in those early days, there was a sense of distance about him. A calm so complete, it felt unnatural. He rented a small apartment in Albany, a short bus ride from campus. He owned few possessions, a bed, a desk, and a few cooking pans. He spent most nights preparing lectures or reading mathematics journals by lamplight. The classroom ghost. Ted's classes were small, advanced courses in complex analysis. Students remembered him as an enigma, soft-spoken, almost painfully shy, yet dazzling when he spoke of mathematics. He would arrive precisely on time, set his notes on the desk, and begin writing proofs with crisp efficiency. His handwriting was meticulous, his logic impeccable. But he rarely looked up and never smiled. When students asked questions, he answered briefly, precisely, and without warmth. He seemed to speak not to people, but to the blackboard itself. After class, he disappeared. No office hours, no small talk, no coffee breaks in the faculty lounge. He was a teacher in title, but a recluse in practice. One student later recalled, "He wasn't unkind, he just seemed elsewhere, like the rest of us were background noise." A campus in revolt. Outside his classroom, Berkeley was chaos. The late 1960s were an awakening. Civil rights marches, free speech rallies, anti-war sit-ins. Students filled the air with music, politics, and rebellion. To Ted, it all felt like disorder, a cacophony of emotion and ideology. He respected logic, not shouting. He viewed the counterculture with skepticism. Its call for freedom felt to him undisciplined. Yet in a deeper way, he shared its alienation, its sense that modern civilization had gone wrong. He watched from a distance as machines and protests collided. computer research centres rising beside picket lines, data labs humming while students burned draft cards outside. It was a perfect metaphor for the split that would define his life, technology advancing while humanity tore at itself. He was both witness and exile. The Solitude Intensifies Berkeley offered no community for Ted. The mathematics department was collegial but social by nature. Faculty dinners, department picnics, research collaborations. He avoided them all. He declined invitations with quiet politeness, or simply failed to appear. When colleagues knocked on his office door, they often found it locked. He preferred solitude. In that solitude, his thoughts began to drift away from mathematics towards something less defined, a longing for simplicity, for silence, for escape. His letters home became shorter. His brother David noticed a change. Ted's tone grew colder, his sentences more clipped. He was shutting down emotionally, David would later recall. Cracks in the academic facade. Though he performed well at first, the spark of enthusiasm faded quickly. The more he taught, the more he questioned the purpose of it all. To Ted, academia began to resemble the industrial system he despised, a hierarchy of authority, grants, and competition. Professors were rewarded not for truth but for productivity, for publishing, networking, conforming. He saw it as another machine, and he could feel himself trapped inside it. His lectures grew shorter, his grading more erratic. Students sensed his detachment. He didn't seem to care if we understood, one recalled. He just wanted to finish and leave. By 1968, he stopped attending departmental meetings altogether. He communicated mostly by notes slipped under doors. The turning point. In early 1969, after just 2 years on faculty, Ted submitted his resignation. He gave no reason. The head of the department was stunned. "You're one of our best young mathematicians," he said. "Is it money? A promotion?" Ted simply shook his head. He told no one his plans. There was no farewell party, no goodbye dinner. One day he was there. The next, his office was empty. He left behind only a few papers and a stack of chalk dust-covered notes, proofs that no one else could decipher completely. Back to Illinois, Ted returned to his parents' home in Lombard, Illinois. His mother was relieved to have him back. His father was proud but puzzled. "He's restless," Wanda confided to a neighbor. For a time, Ted tried to adapt to ordinary life. He worked briefly in a foam rubber factory with his brother, using his hands instead of his mind. The routine appealed to him. Simple, tangible work far from the abstractions of academia. But even that world began to feel stifling. Machines surrounded him there too. Presses, cutters, timers. He began to dream of a life without them. A life where survival depended on skill, not electricity. He started taking long walks in the woods outside town, sometimes disappearing for hours. He spoke of nature with a reverence that bordered on spiritual. The idea of escape. In 1969, Ted made a decision that would change everything. He would live alone, completely self-sufficient off the land. He studied maps of the American wilderness, Montana, Idaho, the Dakotas. He ordered manuals on survival, trapping, and cabin building. He practiced archery and learned to identify edible plants. This wasn't impulse, it was a plan. He was designing a new life the way a mathematician designs a proof. Precise, deliberate, logical. To friends and family it seemed eccentric but harmless. To Ted, it was liberation, philosophy in the making. As he prepared for his retreat, Ted's journals filled with reflections. He wrote about the unnatural pace of modern life, the loss of human independence, and the tyranny of industrial systems. He saw the modern man as enslaved, not by kings or governments, but by technology itself. Every convenience, he believed, weakened the spirit. Every machine tightened the cage. He wasn't yet violent. He was still reasoning, still theorizing, but his thinking was solidifying into conviction. In one note he wrote, It is not enough to withdraw from the system. One must resist it. That sentence would one day become prophecy. A brother's worry. David Kaczynski noticed his brother's growing obsession with withdrawal. Ted spoke less of mathematics and more of purity, of living as mankind once had. When David tried to engage him, Ted's patience snapped. "You don't understand," he said. "Everything they build destroys something natural." David brushed it off as philosophy, yet there was an edge to Ted's tone, a finality that unsettled him. By late 1969, Ted's mind was made up. He saved what little money he had, gathered tools, and prepared to leave. The world he left behind Berkeley hardly noticed his absence. Professors came and went, revolutions burned and faded. The young mathematician who had dazzled them with logic vanished into obscurity. But the silence he left behind was not peace. It was incubation. Within that silence, in the deep forests of the American West, Ted Kaczynski would begin to translate his theories into a way of life, and eventually, a campaign of resistance. The academic world had given him structure but no meaning. The wilderness would give him meaning, but no mercy. The man who walked away. In 1967, Theodore Kaczynski was one of the youngest professors in America. By 1969, he had renounced it all: the university, the city, the system. He believed he was freeing himself from the machine. What he did not yet know was that he was walking directly into its shadow. The chalkboard had been his first laboratory. The forest would be his second. And there, far from the noise of civilization, the former prodigy would finally become the hermit and the ideologue the world would later come to know. 1969, Montana Cabin. In 1969, as America celebrated the space race and urban centers hummed with the promise of technology, one man walked away from it all. Theodore Kaczynski, 27, mathematician, prodigy, former Harvard student and Berkeley professor, would vanish into the Montana wilderness. What he sought was not adventure. It was autonomy. It was freedom from the machine. Arrival in the wilderness. Ted Kaczynski left Illinois quietly, carrying little more than a backpack, tools, and notebooks filled with meticulous handwriting. He traveled west by bus and hitchhike, passing through industrial towns, highways, and stretches of farmland. Each mile into the mountains brought him further from civilization and closer to a self-fashioned world of his own making. Near Lincoln, Montana, he found a secluded clearing amid dense forest and steep ridges, roughly 3 miles from the nearest road. Here, in the shadow of untouched wilderness, he decided to make his stand. The land was harsh. Winters could drop to 40 degrees below zero, summers brought relentless mosquitoes, and every day presented a struggle to survive. To most, it was inhospitable. To Ted, it was sanctuary. Building the cabin. Ted constructed his cabin with methodical precision. Using hand tools, he cut timber from the surrounding forest and laid the foundation himself. The structure was simple: one small room, roughly 10 by 12 feet, with a dirt floor, a wood-burning stove, and shelves of carefully arranged supplies. No electricity, no plumbing, no telephone, no outside influence. This cabin was more than shelter. It was a statement, a rejection of modern society, technology, and dependency. Each board he sawed, each nail he hammered, symbolized independence. Every task of survival reinforced the principles that would come to define his worldview: self-sufficiency, control, and mastery over circumstance. He spent long hours in solitude, chopping firewood, gathering water, and maintaining his cabin. The rhythm of his life was dictated by necessity. Hunger, cold, and fatigue became markers of time, as integral to existence as sunrise and sunset. Life in isolation. Ted's days followed a strict routine. He rose at dawn, chopped wood, foraged or hunted small game, and maintained a modest garden. Water was collected from nearby streams and filtered through sand and cloth. Meals were simple and repetitive, but each one was a tangible proof of his independence. Evenings were reserved for reading, writing, and reflection. By the light of a kerosene lamp, he documented his thoughts on civilization, technology, and human behavior. He scrutinized industrial society, critiqued mechanized progress, and questioned the moral cost of technological dependence. He wrote, "Every tool we make enslaves us. Every convenience diminishes freedom. Man has become a servant to his own inventions." It was here, in the quiet of the Montana forest, that his ideological foundations were forged, a philosophy of resistance, a vision of civilization as a cage, and an unyielding commitment to living outside its constraints. Psychological transformation. In his journals, Ted described the modern world as corrupt and controlling. Factories, offices, and universities were all part of the machine that coerced conformity. He believed technological society robbed humans of autonomy, freedom, and connection to nature. Isolation, he wrote, revealed clarity. Removed from social pressures, he could observe civilization objectively and see its flaws. The wilderness became both laboratory and refuge, a place to test his ability to live unbound by the rules of society. He began to fantasize about what he saw as resistance, not just personal withdrawal, but challenging the system he perceived as oppressive. These thoughts were abstract, philosophical, and relentless, the ideological blueprint for actions he would later take. Encounters with the outside world. Although largely withdrawn, Ted occasionally ventured into Lincoln to purchase supplies or mail letters. These trips were brief and transactional. He avoided conversation whenever possible. He viewed the townspeople, the clerks, and the workers with growing alienation. To him, they represented the machinery of compliance. Humans enslaved to convenience, reliant on systems and unaware of their own subjugation. These perceptions intensified his sense of separation. The world of machines, of schedules, of authority, was alien. The wilderness was real. Civilization was corrupt and was developing a philosophy of resistance. By late 1969, Ted's writings revealed a deliberate framework for resisting the industrial system. While still abstract, the ideas now combined practical survival with ethical judgment. Autonomy required withdrawal from societal systems. Technology was a force that diminished human freedom. Civilization corrupted the human spirit and destroyed natural balance. Resistance was both moral and practical, achievable through self-sufficiency and critical thought. These ideas would evolve over the next decade into a fully formed ideology, one that eventually underpinned his later campaign against what he called the machine. The role of nature. Nature was central to his worldview. In the forest he observed patterns, cycles, and interdependence, the ant, the stream, the trees. Each lesson in ecology reinforced his belief in simplicity, survival, and human limitation. He wrote that in the wilderness one could see society clearly, a network of systems humans serve, rather than control. A place like the forest revealed truth, he argued, because it was untouched by human artifice. A man is free only where he provides for himself, he noted. Dependence is slavery. Machines enslave. Isolation as ideological incubation. Ted's solitude had a dual purpose. It was both practical, avoiding human influence, and philosophical, allowing thought to crystallize. He meticulously chronicled his reflections, which combined natural observation, social critique, and moral reasoning. This period marked the beginning of his ideological hardening. Whereas earlier he had withdrawn from society due to discomfort, now his isolation was a conscious strategy to refine his beliefs and distance himself from systems he deemed corrupt. The wilderness offered both discipline and clarity. He was free from social expectation, free from distraction, free to live by principles he defined himself. The foreshadowing of extremism. While he did not engage in violence at this stage, Ted's writings show a growing willingness to confront civilization conceptually. He imagined society as an adversary, impersonal, relentless, and dangerous. He theorized that change required action, though he had not yet moved beyond philosophical musings. His journals record an intensifying belief that civilization's trajectory, its reliance on machines and systems, was incompatible with human freedom. Though still a recluse and a philosopher, the seeds of future radicalization were evident: alienation from society, hatred of technological dependence, a vision of humans living in balance with nature, contempt for modern institutions. These early ideas would eventually justify, in his mind, more extreme measures: a life of discipline. Ted measured his days by survival, not time. Every morning brought physical work, chopping wood, carrying water, clearing snow. Every evening brought reflection, reading, and writing. Even boredom was a teacher. In monotony, he sharpened his focus. In hunger, he learned endurance. In isolation, he learned self-reliance. His existence in the cabin was rigorous, austere, and absolute. It mirrored his ideals: minimal, self-sufficient, disciplined, and separate from the corrupting influences of civilization. The birth of the hermit. In Montana, Theodore Kaczynski became more than a man in the woods. He became an idea incarnate, the autonomous individual resisting the machine. Civilization, with all its conveniences, was distant. Nature, with all its demands, was immediate. Here, in the solitude of survival, his mind hardened. His philosophy was taking shape, a system of thought that would, in time, drive him to actions the world could scarcely comprehend. The cabin was small, but the world it contained was vast: a mind at war with society, a philosophy incubating in isolation, a man preparing for a life that civilization would never understand. The wilderness offered freedom, discipline, and clarity, but also the perfect environment for the radicalization of a genius. From this quiet corner of Montana, the outline of a man at odds with the industrial age was complete. The hermit was born, the ideology was born, and the world would one day feel the shadow of the machine he had decided to resist. 1978. First bombs. By the late 1970s, America had entered a new era. Factories churned, office buildings hummed with computers, and technology promised to transform daily life. But in the quiet forests of Montana, one man had grown increasingly convinced that the machine was enslaving humanity. Theodore Kaczynski, a mathematician turned hermit, was about to take the first steps from ideology to action. A long incubation. Ted Kaczynski had spent nearly a decade in Montana by 1978, fully immersed in the rhythm of the wilderness. The solitude had sharpened his intellect, hardened his worldview, and radicalized his philosophy. In his journals, he articulated a vision that fused personal autonomy with opposition to technological civilization. He wrote of industrial systems that erode human dignity and the moral imperative to resist automation and control. While his life in the cabin was austere and deliberate, he increasingly felt that mere isolation was not enough. Observing the encroachment of modern society from afar, he concluded that civilization itself was an adversary, one that needed to be confronted. First moves into public action. In 1978, Ted's private reflections transitioned into outward action. The first incidents attributed to him targeted the institutions he believed symbolized the machine: universities, airlines, and corporations engaged in technological research. Authorities and journalists would later describe these initial events as shocking in their precision and selectivity. The targets were not random. They were carefully chosen to represent what Ted saw as the expansion of technological control. Though the specific mechanics of the attacks are not disclosed in public accounts, the pattern was clear. He acted with deliberation, aiming to instill fear while avoiding indiscriminate harm whenever possible. Psychological profile. By now, Kaczynski's isolation had produced a psychological intensity rare even among extreme hermits. Experts later noted hyper-focus. Ted devoted his full attention to planning and analysis. Every move was calculated, and his decisions were guided by his ideology. Ideological certainty. He had internalized his philosophy so completely that he viewed opposing systems as morally illegitimate. Operational patience. His actions unfolded over years, demonstrating remarkable discipline and strategic foresight. This combination of intelligence, isolation, and moral absolutism made him uniquely dangerous in abstract terms, even without going into technical details. Impact on institutions. The early incidents created widespread unease. Universities tightened security, and corporations became wary of packages and correspondence. Though few understood who was responsible, the sense of vulnerability was immediate. Ted's campaign was not simply about physical disruption, it was psychological. He sought to make institutions feel the cost of technological dependence, to expose their vulnerability, and to demonstrate that the machine was not invulnerable. The incidents were covered in local newspapers first, then in national media. The early reports emphasized the mystery and precision, highlighting the audacity of a perpetrator who seemed to strike from nowhere. Media attention and public fear. By targeting prominent institutions, the campaign quickly attracted media attention. Headlines spoke of unexplained explosions and mysterious devices, fueling both fear and curiosity. Public perception framed the perpetrator as an enigma, brilliant, patient, and ideologically motivated. Journalists speculated endlessly about the identity and motives of the attacker. Ted, in his Montana cabin, remained completely removed from the media storm. He monitored news reports and used them as feedback, carefully noting how the world responded to each incident. This allowed him to refine his understanding of the social and psychological impact of his actions, not the technical mechanics, but the consequences. Pattern and philosophy. Analysis of the early campaign reveals a consistent ideological through-line: target selection. Each target represented an aspect of the technological or industrial system. Strategic restraint. Actions were executed to maximize disruption without indiscriminate harm. Message over destruction. The ultimate goal was to communicate his critique of technology, not simply to cause chaos. In later reflections, Ted would articulate this philosophy more fully. He believed the machine had to be opposed, and that symbolic acts could expose society's dependence and moral compromise. Law enforcement response. The early incidents prompted a nationwide law enforcement response. Agencies studied patterns, analyzed communication, and attempted to understand the mind behind the campaign. Behavioral psychologists were consulted to develop a profile of the perpetrator. Highly intelligent, patient, and disciplined, ideologically motivated rather than emotionally impulsive, knowledgeable about procedures, systems, and security vulnerabilities, the profile pointed to a methodical, highly autonomous individual, someone capable of operating alone in remote conditions. Though law enforcement could not yet identify him, the groundwork was being laid for the investigative methods that would eventually lead to his capture nearly 2 decades later. The psychological toll on society. Even at this early stage, the campaign had a profound effect on public consciousness. Institutions began reviewing internal processes, universities implemented strict security protocols, and the public became wary of unsolicited packages. The fear was psychological as much as physical. Ted's philosophy of resistance, that technological society makes humans vulnerable, resonated even in the form of anxiety. People began to question the very conveniences they had previously taken for granted. In essence, the first acts achieved their intended effect: to reveal the fragility of systems, the dependence of humans on technology, and the social consequences of industrial progress. Isolation as strategic advantage. Ted's cabin in Montana provided a perfect strategic advantage. The remoteness allowed him to observe society without interference, giving him the freedom to plan, reflect, and act without risk of immediate detection. He lived according to strict routines that optimized both survival and mental clarity. The wilderness became a laboratory for thought, and his isolation allowed him to refine both his philosophy and his methods of influencing the broader world. By living apart from society, he could test his theories about dependence and freedom, reinforcing the notion that civilization itself was vulnerable to disruption by someone operating entirely outside its structures. Escalation. Over time. While the first incidents were carefully targeted and relatively limited in scope, they established a pattern. The perpetrator acted slowly and deliberately. Each event was an extension of a coherent philosophy. Public and institutional reactions were measured and studied. This escalation was psychological as much as operational. Ted was refining his approach, observing how institutions reacted to stress, and learning which systems were most susceptible to disruption. Experts later noted that his campaign was as much a communication strategy as an attack. Each event sent a message about technological dependency, social control, and human vulnerability. Ideology in action. By 1978, Theodore Kaczynski had crossed from thought into action. The wilderness had transformed him from a recluse into a strategist. His attacks, though limited in scope, were symbolic statements, experiments in the psychology of society. He was testing his theory that industrial civilization, for all its sophistication, could be challenged by a single, disciplined mind operating outside its structures. The Montana cabin was no longer simply a home. It was a command center of ideology, a place where solitude, intellect, and philosophy converged. The man who had once calculated equations for beauty and precision was now calculating the vulnerabilities of civilization itself. The stage was set. The world had begun to feel the shadow of the machine. And from the quiet forest, the hermit was watching, thinking, waiting. 1985. Manifesto written. By the mid-1980s, Theodore Kaczynski had been living in Montana for over 15 years. The hermit's solitude had sharpened his intellect, hardened his philosophy, and crystallized his critique of technological society. The world, however, had grown faster than he had expected, and the machine had grown louder, more pervasive. In 1985, he sought to articulate his vision in writing, a manifesto that would become both his argument and his testament. A decade of isolation and observation. By 1985, Kaczynski's life was rigidly structured. His cabin, small and austere, had become a laboratory of thought. He hunted, foraged, chopped wood, and maintained his survival with meticulous care. But his intellectual life was equally disciplined. Ted spent hours writing, reading, and reflecting. His notebooks had grown into dense volumes of philosophy, criticism, and observation, meditations on the industrial system, the erosion of human freedom, and the corrosive influence of technology. He scrutinized newspapers and scientific journals that reached him via infrequent trips to Lincoln. Each article, each report, confirmed what he had long suspected. Society was increasingly dominated by machines, bureaucracies, and systems that demanded compliance. In his journals, he wrote, "Every technological advance strengthens the machine, diminishes autonomy, and enslaves the individual." These reflections were no longer abstract musings. They were the foundation for his first cohesive expression of ideology. The writing process. Ted began systematically drafting what would become industrial society and its future. He treated the manuscript with the precision of a mathematician. Every sentence was scrutinized, every argument tested against logic and observation. The process took months. He wrote long passages by hand, revised them, and transferred sections to typewritten pages. He cross-referenced ideas, cited examples from history and contemporary society, and wove together philosophy, sociology, and personal observation. The manifesto was not simply a critique, it was a call for reflection. It outlined the dangers of unchecked technological progress and the consequences for human freedom. It detailed the psychological and social effects of industrialization, describing how society conditioned individuals to serve its imperatives rather than their own interests. He wrote with meticulous care, "The system does not merely limit choice. It shapes desires, programs thought, and ultimately defines reality." This was the intellectual culmination of nearly 2 decades of isolation and reflection, a philosophical skeleton of everything he believed about technology, freedom, and society. A coherent philosophy emerges. By 1985, Kaczynski's ideas had coalesced into a fully formed worldview. The manifesto argued, in essence, industrial society is inherently oppressive. Technological progress inevitably creates systems that limit human autonomy. Humans lose freedom under technological dependency. Individuals become cogs in industrial, corporate, and bureaucratic machinery. Resistance is necessary. To preserve autonomy, humans must critically evaluate and, in some cases, reject the systems that dominate their lives. Awareness precedes change. Before any corrective action is possible, society must first recognize the dangers inherent in its own structures. While he had lived for years in practical isolation, the manifesto was an attempt to extend his philosophy outward, to communicate it to society in a form that could not be ignored. The influence of observation. Ted's long study of society informed the manifesto. He drew on patterns he had observed over decades. The proliferation of large corporations controlling essential resources, increasing dependence on computers and mechanized processes, social behaviors conditioned by convenience, efficiency, and conformity. He wrote not just as a recluse, but as a social critic, dissecting civilization with the eye of a mathematician, seeking patterns, identifying systemic flaws, and deriving conclusions from careful observation. The wilderness had taught him discipline. Society had given him the subject of his inquiry. Personal philosophy and isolation. The manifesto was also intensely personal. Kaczynski's isolation in Montana provided the solitude necessary to clarify his ideas without interference or compromise. Living entirely removed from modern society, he could test his philosophy against lived experience. Daily survival reinforced his argument that dependence on systems weakens individuals and that human ingenuity and independence flourish when stripped of artificial support. In many ways, the manifesto was a reflection of his life in miniature, austere, disciplined, deliberate, and unwavering in its critique of the modern world. The goal of the manuscript. Unlike his earlier journals, the manifesto had a purpose: to communicate directly to society. Ted wanted people to see, to think, and to question. He hoped his arguments might spark awareness of the machine and its consequences. He wrote, "The industrial technological system may well be the most powerful force in history. Its growth is inevitable unless humans recognize its costs." At the time, he imagined the manifesto could reach academics, policymakers, or the broader public, anyone capable of reflection and change. Though written in isolation, it was meant to interact with the world, to confront it intellectually, and to challenge its assumptions. Preparation for publication. Ted spent months refining the manuscript, checking for clarity, consistency, and rigor. Every argument was weighed carefully. Every word was chosen deliberately. He considered multiple avenues for dissemination: private circulation, submission to intellectual journals, and ultimately public publication. He sought a platform that would allow the ideas to reach a broad audience while preserving the philosophical integrity of the work. He wrote not in haste, but with the precision of someone who had spent years observing, calculating, and reasoning. The manifesto's themes. The central themes of industrial society and its future can be summarized as autonomy versus dependence. Humans must retain control over their lives, rather than surrendering it to systems or machines. Critique of technology. Technological advances, while seemingly beneficial, carry hidden costs that erode freedom. Moral responsibility. Individuals and societies must reflect critically on the structures they create and maintain. Urgency. The longer society ignores these problems, the more entrenched dependency becomes. These were not simple complaints. They were the systematic reasoning of a mind that had spent years in observation, contemplation, and intellectual isolation. The philosophical legacy. While the manifesto would later gain notoriety for the context in which it was published, at the time of writing it was primarily an intellectual project. Ted believed that ideas could influence reality. He thought that by articulating the risks of industrial society, he could awaken others to the moral and psychological dangers of technology. His time in Montana had provided him with both the practical skills and the mental clarity to develop this work. Living outside society gave him a vantage point few could claim, a perspective unclouded by social pressures, trends, or convenience. The ideologue emerges. By 1985, Theodore Kaczynski had transformed from recluse to ideologue. The wilderness had refined his philosophy, and the manifesto crystallized it. He had lived, observed, and thought in isolation, and now he had produced a work meant to confront the industrial world with the truths he had uncovered. The hermit had become a philosopher, and the philosopher had become a voice of warning against the machine. The manifesto was more than a document. It was the intellectual culmination of decades of study, solitude, and reflection. It was the articulation of a worldview that had been incubating in the forests of Montana, a vision of human freedom, the dangers of technological dependence, and the moral imperative to resist systems that diminish autonomy. From this point onward, Kaczynski's philosophy would no longer be contained within the cabin. It would enter the public sphere, first as words and later as an undeniable force in American life. 1995, Washington Post publication. By 1995, nearly 2 decades had passed since Theodore Kaczynski first vanished into the Montana wilderness. During that time, his philosophy of resistance to industrial society had gradually transformed into a nationwide enigma. His writings, now collected in a manifesto, were about to bring the world and his family to a reckoning. The long wait. After years of calculated actions, Kaczynski had cultivated a pattern. Each incident, each note, each statement was designed to attract attention without revealing his identity. Law enforcement had struggled to understand him, psychologists attempted to profile him, and the public remained intrigued and fearful. By the early 1990s, Ted's writings had become increasingly structured, culminating in a manuscript that fully articulated his critique of industrial society. He insisted it be published, asserting that society needed to hear his ideas before further escalation occurred. At this point, his brother David played a subtle but pivotal role, though he did not yet know the full truth. Negotiating with the media, Ted communicated with major newspapers, offering a stark proposition. He would cease his campaign if a major publication printed his manifesto. The proposal shocked the public and the press. Editors grappled with ethical questions. Should they publish a document authored by someone responsible for acts of terror? Could ideas be separated from the actions that accompanied them? After deliberation, the Washington Post agreed, making an unprecedented decision. The manifesto would be published in full, accompanied by a preface emphasizing the moral and practical context, that the goal was to end the campaign by revealing the author's identity. Publication day. In September 1995, the manifesto appeared in the Washington Post. Across the nation, readers were confronted with Ted Kaczynski's philosophy, laid bare. A rigorous critique of technological society, industrial growth, and the erosion of human freedom. It was meticulous, disciplined, and uncompromising. A window into the mind of someone who had spent decades observing civilization from the isolation of Montana. Public reactions were mixed. Intellectuals debated the ideas. Ordinary readers were horrified by the context of violence. Law enforcement examined the document for clues. Across the country, families and journalists studied every sentence, searching for patterns that might reveal the author's identity. Recognition by family David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother read the manifesto with a sense of growing unease. Something in the phrasing, the tone, and the ideological focus felt painfully familiar. After careful reflection, David reached a devastating conclusion. His brother was the author. The realization was not immediate. It grew piece by piece until the truth became undeniable. Faced with the moral weight of this knowledge, David made a choice. He contacted the FBI. His action was driven by a desire to prevent further harm, even as it meant exposing his own family to national scrutiny. Law enforcement breakthrough. The manifesto provided the breakthrough law enforcement needed. Linguistic analysis, coupled with David's recognition, allowed investigators to focus their efforts. Patterns in writing, phrasing, and vocabulary narrowed the search. Investigators combined traditional techniques, examining financial records, travel patterns, and property ownership, with modern forensic linguistics, a relatively new field at the time. The process was painstaking but methodical, reflecting the meticulous nature of both the perpetrator and the investigation. Within months, the culmination of decades-long investigation and the publication of the manifesto led law enforcement directly to the Montana cabin, setting the stage for Ted Kaczynski's eventual arrest. Impact on society. The publication had broader effects beyond the investigation. Readers across the nation were forced to engage with the arguments themselves, separate from the campaign of terror. Debates erupted in newspapers, universities, and television programs about technology, autonomy, and freedom. Some saw the manifesto as a cautionary tale about the dehumanizing effects of industrial society. Others condemned it as the rationalization of criminal behavior. Either way, it entered public discourse, shaping conversations about ethics, technology, and the limits of civilization. Psychological perspective. For Ted, the publication was a culmination of years of planning and ideological development. The act of having his philosophy appear in print validated his work in his own mind. From the perspective of psychologists who later studied the case, the manifesto reflected a mind that had maintained extreme discipline over decades, applied analytical reasoning to social critique, developed a worldview in isolation with minimal external influence, used communication strategically to achieve a specific goal. While his actions had terrorized society, the document itself became a study in rationalized ideology and psychological insight. A brother's dilemma. David Kaczynski faced an excruciating ethical decision. Should he alert authorities, knowing it would lead to his brother's arrest and prosecution? Could he reconcile his love for family with his responsibility to prevent further harm? Ultimately, he chose responsibility over loyalty, providing critical evidence and insight that would lead to Ted's capture. His courage highlighted the human dimension of the story, the intersection of familial bonds, moral obligation, and societal safety. The turning point. In 1995, the publication of the manifesto transformed a decades-long mystery into a solvable case. Theodore Kaczynski, the hermit in the Montana wilderness, was now exposed to the world he had observed and critiqued for so long. The ideas that had simmered in isolation were now public, sparking debate, fear, and ultimately action. The endgame had begun. The Washington Post publication was not the climax of the story, but the turning point. It bridged the gap between isolation and accountability, between philosophy and consequence. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, society could confront the mind behind the myth, and the stage was set for the final chapter in the hermit's long vigil against civilization. 1996, arrest. By 1996, the years of observation, isolation, and calculated action had brought Theodore Kaczynski into sharp focus for law enforcement. The manifesto had provided the breakthrough, and the hermit of Montana, the man who had evaded detection for nearly 2 decades, was about to face the world he had watched from afar. The investigation culminates. After the 1995 publication of Industrial Society and Its Future, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies gained critical insight into Kaczynski's identity. The linguistic patterns in the manifesto, coupled with familial recognition from his brother David, narrowed the search to a single suspect living in remote Montana. Investigators compiled a profile. Highly intelligent and disciplined ideologically, motivated rather than impulsive, experienced with isolation and self-sufficiency, likely to operate alone. The profile matched Theodore Kaczynski perfectly, allowing law enforcement to focus resources on the wilderness region where he had long lived. Surveillance and planning authorities began a careful observation of the property near Lincoln, Montana. The cabin was small, remote, and heavily wooded, providing natural concealment. Law enforcement documented routines, supply visits, and environmental cues, seeking an opportunity to make a safe and effective intervention. The months of planning reflected the same methodical patience Kaczynski had shown in his own actions. Agents were cautious. One misstep could compromise the arrest or put officers at risk. David Kaczynski's role. David Kaczynski continued to assist investigators, providing crucial insight into his brother's writing style, thought patterns, and behavioral tendencies. His knowledge of Theodore's personality, habits, and worldview proved invaluable. The decision to cooperate with law enforcement was emotionally complex. David grappled with feelings of loyalty, love, and moral responsibility. Ultimately, he prioritized public safety, demonstrating the profound human dimension of the investigation. The arrest. In April 1996, law enforcement moved to take Kaczynski into custody. Agents approached the remote cabin with caution, mindful of the isolation and potential dangers inherent in the terrain. The arrest itself was swift and precise. Kaczynski, though surprised, offered no resistance. The operation concluded without injury, and he was taken into custody for questioning. The hermit who had evaded detection for nearly 2 decades was now confronted with the consequences of his actions and the society he had long observed from a distance. Initial reactions. The arrest stunned the nation. Media coverage spread quickly, emphasizing the contrast between Kaczynski's genius and his life as a recluse in Montana. Experts, journalists, and the public reflected on the decades-long saga. How could a man live in isolation for so long while eluding detection? How did his intellect and discipline enable such sustained evasion? What drove him to spend nearly 20 years meticulously observing society while remaining hidden? The arrest answered some questions, but raised others about motivation, ideology, and the human capacity for both brilliance and extremism. Kaczynski's response. At the time of his arrest, Kaczynski remained remarkably calm. He appeared detached, analytical, and internally consistent with the persona that had defined his decades in isolation. He cooperated in limited ways with investigators, often answering questions in terse, precise statements. Observers noted that his detachment seemed less fear than a continuation of the methodical mindset he had cultivated in Montana. His focus remained largely on his ideology. He consistently framed his actions and choices in terms of his critique of technological society, reinforcing the connection between his isolation, his philosophy, and the events that had brought him into the national spotlight. Public and legal implications. The arrest immediately shifted the public conversation. The decades-long mystery had ended, and attention turned to legal accountability, societal reflection, and philosophical debate. The case raised questions about the psychological development of individuals in extreme isolation, the relationship between intellect, ideology, and action, how society recognizes, prevents, and responds to long-term threats. Legal analysts and psychologists dissected the arrest and the preceding investigation, studying the meticulous planning of both Kaczynski and law enforcement. The arrest itself became a case study in patience, observation, and strategy. Family and emotional dimensions. David Kaczynski faced the aftermath of his difficult decision. While the arrest provided closure for law enforcement and the public, It also reinforced the emotional toll of familial responsibility, guilt, and moral obligation. The Kaczynski family grappled with conflicting feelings: relief that the investigation had concluded, sorrow over the consequences for their son and brother, and reflection on the decades-long isolation that had shaped him. The turning point. The arrest in Montana marked the end of nearly 20 years of observation, planning, and evasion. For Theodore Kaczynski, the hermit who had lived outside civilization, the world he had resisted had finally arrived at his doorstep. The campaign that had haunted institutions, captivated investigators, and provoked public debate was over, and the philosophical questions that had driven him for decades were about to enter the courtroom, the media, and the broader consciousness of a nation. Legacy of the arrest. Though the legal process would follow, the arrest itself became a cultural and psychological milestone. It demonstrated how isolation, intellect, and ideology can converge in extreme ways. The role of family, insight, and moral courage in resolving complex cases. The interplay between society and individuals who reject or resist its structures. For historians, psychologists, and the public, the arrest was a moment of reckoning, a bridge between the philosophy incubated in isolation and the real-world consequences of sustained opposition to modern systems. The Montana cabin, once a sanctuary, now symbolized both genius and extremism, intellect and consequence. 1998, trial and imprisonment. By 1998, Theodore Kaczynski's long and secretive life in the Montana wilderness had ended. Arrested 2 years earlier, the man who had spent decades observing society from afar was now facing the full scrutiny of the judicial system. The trial would not only determine his fate, but also probe the boundaries between ideology, intellect, and responsibility. Prelude to court. Following his arrest in 1996, Kaczynski was held in federal custody while prosecutors built their case. The investigation had been thorough, the evidence substantial, and the nation was captivated. His case attracted enormous media attention. Journalists, scholars, and the public were eager to understand the mind behind the long-running campaign. Kaczynski remained composed, almost entirely detached from the frenzy surrounding him. In custody, he spent his days reading, writing, and reflecting much as he had in his Montana cabin. Isolation, once voluntary, had become imposed. Yet his disciplined routines persisted. Time was measured, tasks were deliberate, and thought was precise. Psychologists and legal analysts were fascinated. Here was a man who combined extreme intellect with decades of self-imposed isolation, a life spent observing society's structures while living entirely apart from them. They speculated endlessly about how his experiences in the wilderness had shaped both his philosophy and his approach to life in confinement. Legal strategy and plea decisions. Initially, Kaczynski attempted to represent himself at various points, signaling a desire to control the narrative and maintain agency over how he was perceived. The courts, however, insisted on legal representation due to the complexities of the case. Defense attorneys faced a difficult challenge, balancing acknowledgement of criminal responsibility with attempts to contextualize Kaczynski's actions within his psychological, ideological, and philosophical framework. The defense considered raising an insanity plea, highlighting his isolation, rigid worldview, and long-term social detachment. Ultimately, Kaczynski rejected extensive exploration of mental illness and chose a path focused on pragmatism. He understood the gravity of the situation and sought to avoid a death sentence. The decision reflected the same disciplined, strategic thinking that had defined his life for decades. The guilty plea. In January 1998, Kaczynski pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. The plea was a culmination of careful deliberation, a pragmatic choice rooted in both self-preservation and acknowledgement of the legal realities. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence was final, removing him from society permanently, while allowing the legal system to avoid a protracted and highly publicized capital trial. While some commentators interpreted the plea as acceptance of responsibility, others noted the continued presence of ideological conviction. Kaczynski did not renounce his critique of technological society. He simply acknowledged that the state would impose permanent confinement. The trial's broader context. Although the trial itself was relatively brief due to the guilty plea, the proceedings provided a platform for public discussion about technology, society, and personal responsibility. Scholars and journalists debated the implications of Kaczynski's philosophy, attempting to separate his critique of industrial civilization from the methods he had used to command attention. Psychologists analyzed the factors that contributed to his radicalization, isolation, intellectual intensity, early participation in controversial psychological experiments, and his extraordinary ability to maintain focus on abstract principles. The trial also raised ethical questions. To what extent should society grapple with the ideas of someone who had caused real harm? Could the philosophy be examined objectively without condoning the acts themselves? Life in prison. After sentencing, Kaczynski was placed in federal prison, where he remained under strict supervision. The prison environment was a stark contrast to the solitude and autonomy he had cultivated in Montana. Yet even in confinement, he maintained routines reminiscent of his hermit life: careful attention to reading and writing, structured daily schedules, limited interactions with others, preserving mental space and autonomy. His isolation was no longer voluntary but imposed, yet he adapted, maintaining intellectual engagement and continued reflection. Prison became another environment in which his disciplined mind could operate, even under restrictive conditions. Psychological and philosophical observations. Experts who studied Kaczynski in prison noted the continuation of patterns established in Montana: extreme self-discipline, rigorous mental focus, and unyielding adherence to principles. His confinement demonstrated how deeply his identity was rooted in independence, ideology, and intellectual exercise. Kaczynski continued to write extensively, producing essays and reflections on technology, human freedom, and society. While access to his works was controlled, his intellectual footprint persisted, offering scholars insight into the long-term evolution of thought cultivated in isolation. Psychologists emphasize the unusual combination of intellect, isolation, and moral absolutism that characterized his life. Unlike many criminals, Kaczynski demonstrated sustained planning, self-regulation, and strategic reasoning, attributes evident throughout both his Montana years and his time in prison. Societal reflection. The trial and imprisonment prompted broader reflection on the relationship between individual extremism, ideology, and technological society. Public discourse examined how isolation and intellectual intensity can contribute to radicalization, the moral and ethical responsibilities of family, friends, and institutions in recognizing warning signs, the potential societal consequences of unexamined dependence on industrial and technological systems. While the crimes themselves were shocking, the legal resolution also offered a lens to study prevention, societal resilience, and ethical accountability. Kaczynski's enduring intellectual legacy. Even after conviction, Kaczynski's writings continued to provoke debate. Scholars analyzed his critiques of technology, autonomy, and freedom, separating philosophical argument from the acts that brought him notoriety. His life story became a case study in the effects of long-term isolation on cognitive and moral development, the intersection of genius, obsession, and extremism, the ways in which ideology can shape behavior over decades. Although imprisoned, his intellectual influence persisted, particularly among those interested in technology ethics, social critique, and the psychology of radicalization. The human dimension. Kaczynski's imprisonment highlighted profound human elements: the ethical dilemma faced by his family, particularly his brother, who had helped bring him to justice, the psychological consequences of decades spent in isolation and opposition to society, the societal negotiation between punishment, understanding, and philosophical inquiry. The trial and imprisonment underscored the tension between human intellect, ideological conviction, and societal norms, a tension that had defined Kaczynski's entire adult life. Life behind bars. By 1998, the hermit of Montana had become a prisoner of the state. The cabin, once a laboratory of thought and independence, was replaced by cells and regulations. Yet the mind that had lived in the wilderness continued to reflect, analyze, and write. In prison, Kaczynski remained a symbol of isolation, of intellect, of ideological extremism, and of the enduring human struggle to define freedom in the face of society. Imprisonment marked the end of his active campaign, but not the end of his influence. Scholars, journalists, and readers continued to grapple with his writings, his life story, and the philosophical questions he raised. The trial concluded, the sentence was imposed, and the man once hidden in the Montana forest was now confined for life. Yet the shadow of his ideas persisted, shaping debate about technology, autonomy, and human agency for years to come. 2023, Legacy. By 2023, nearly 8 decades had passed since Theodore Kaczynski was born in Chicago. The man who once vanished into the Montana wilderness and challenged society with both action and philosophy had lived his final years in federal prison. Yet his story, a cautionary tale of intellect, isolation, and ideological extremism, continued to resonate, provoking debate about technology, autonomy, and the human condition. Final years in prison. After decades of confinement, Kaczynski remained in federal prison until his death. Life behind bars had transformed him from the hermit of Montana into a figure of historical, psychological, and philosophical curiosity. Despite the restrictions of prison, he continued to write, correspond, and reflect. His intellectual routines persisted. Mornings dedicated to reading and analysis, afternoons to writing and reflection, evenings to contemplation. His environment was far removed from the wilderness he had once roamed, yet his discipline remained. Prison records, interviews with psychologists, and secondary reports indicate that he maintained the same obsessive attention to structure, order, and intellectual rigor that had defined his life outside society. Death and public response. Kaczynski died quietly in federal custody, a conclusion to a life marked by extreme isolation, meticulous planning, and ideological extremism. The news of his death prompted widespread reflection. Media outlets revisited the events of his life, scholars examined his writings, and the public debated the implications of his actions and philosophy. Obituaries and retrospectives highlighted the complexity of his life. A prodigious intellect, a reclusive genius, a man whose critique of technology was inseparable from acts that terrorized a nation. While his crimes remained condemned, the enduring fascination was not solely with violence, but with the combination of intelligence, isolation, and ideology that had driven him. Intellectual legacy. Kaczynski's manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, continued to be a subject of study. Universities, think tanks, and ethical committees analyzed its critique of technology, human autonomy, and industrial civilization. While the document's context, the campaign of terror he orchestrated, ensured that his philosophy would always be controversial, scholars recognized its analytical rigor. Themes such as the unintended consequences of technological advancement, human dependency on systems and machines, ethical considerations in industrial and post-industrial society remained relevant in discussions of technology, privacy, artificial intelligence, and human agency. Some commentators argued that separating the ideas from the methods was essential to understand the broader societal questions he raised. Others maintained that his actions irrevocably tainted his intellectual output. The debate itself highlighted a profound tension. Can the value of ideas be divorced from the character and actions of those who propose them? Cultural reflections. Kaczynski's life story became a touchstone in popular culture and academic discourse. Documentaries, books, and articles explored the trajectory from childhood prodigy to hermit, ideologue, and criminal. Psychologists, sociologists, and historians examined the interplay of intelligence, isolation, and ideology, asking, how does extreme social isolation affect moral and ethical reasoning? How can society identify and respond to individuals who cultivate radical opposition over decades? What does Kaczynski's life reveal about the balance between freedom, responsibility, and societal structures? The story also prompted reflection on the consequences of modernity itself. Urbanization, technological dependence, and the increasing complexity of social systems. Kaczynski's critique, while extreme, became a lens through which broader questions about civilization and autonomy were debated. Family and human context. David Kaczynski, who had played a critical role in the arrest, continued to speak publicly about the moral and emotional challenges of his involvement. He described the years following the arrest as a balancing act between familial loyalty and moral responsibility, navigating grief, guilt, and the need to protect society. The Kaczynski family's experience offered insight into the human dimension of extremism, the ways in which personal relationships intersect with public responsibility, and the emotional consequences of decisions that save lives but expose family members to scrutiny and heartbreak. Psychological insights. Psychologists and criminal behavior specialists continued to analyze Kaczynski's life as a case study in radicalization. They emphasized several key factors. Early intellectual precocity, coupled with social isolation, may have contributed to detachment from conventional norms. Participation in controversial psychological experiments during adolescence likely shaped his worldview and distrust of authority. Decades of self-imposed isolation provided an environment for obsessive focus and ideological entrenchment. Strategic thinking, patience, and discipline amplified the impact of his actions and prolonged his evasion. The case demonstrated the complex interaction between innate intelligence, environmental factors, and ideological conviction, offering lessons for both preventative strategies and the understanding of extremism. Ongoing debates. Even decades after his imprisonment and death, Kaczynski's life continues to inspire debate. Ethical debates about whether ideas can be separated from actions, the role of technological advancement in shaping society and human freedom, how isolation and extreme ideology can transform thought into action, the responsibilities of society, family, and institutions in recognizing and mitigating long-term risks. Academic journals, conferences, and online forums continue to discuss the implications of his philosophy, often framing it within broader debates on human autonomy, societal complexity, and ethical technology design. The paradox of legacy. Kaczynski's life presents a paradox. On one hand, he was a criminal, responsible for acts that terrorized and harmed. On the other, he was a thinker who forcefully questioned the trajectory of civilization. This duality fuels both fascination and controversy. Society struggles to reconcile the brilliance of his intellect with the extremity of his actions, the rigor of his critique with the moral weight of his methods, the isolation that allowed him clarity with the alienation that enabled extremism. The paradox ensures that his story will remain relevant in discussions about human behavior, ethics, and technology for generations to come. Symbolism of the Montana cabin. The Montana cabin, once a place of refuge and reflection, became a symbol of both independence and extremism. It represented a life lived outside societal norms, a laboratory for ideas, and ultimately a precursor to actions that had national consequences. Historians and sociologists view the cabin as a critical stage in his life story, a physical space where isolation, intellect, and ideology coalesced, producing both insight and extremism. The cabin story reminds us that environment shapes thought, and thought shapes action. In Kaczynski's case, decades of seclusion amplified his convictions and prepared the ground for his notorious campaign. Cultural and educational use. In the years following his death, Kaczynski's writings have been used in educational settings as case studies. Philosophy courses examine his critique of technological society. Psychology programs analyze the effects of isolation and radicalization. Ethics discussions explore the tension between ideas and actions. While controversial, these uses underscore the enduring relevance of his life and thought. His story is a cautionary tale and a springboard for reflection on human freedom, technology, and moral responsibility. The Long Shadow. Theodore Kaczynski died in federal prison, but his story did not end with his death. From a precocious child in Chicago to a hermit in Montana, from a published manifesto to national infamy, his life traced the arc of intellect, isolation, and ideological extremism. The shadow he cast is not one of violence alone, but of questions about freedom, autonomy, and the structures that bind society together. His writings continue to provoke thought, his life continues to provoke debate, and the world continues to reckon with the complex interplay of genius, ideology, and consequence. Kaczynski's legacy is both a warning and a challenge. It asks society to examine the costs of technology, the vulnerability of human systems, and the profound effects of isolation on the human mind. Even in death, the hermit of Montana remains a figure who forces reflection on the allure and danger of independence, on the moral weight of ideas, and on the fragility of civilization in the face of human extremism. The Unabomber, the man who hated the